There is a pattern that kills empires. Not with a single gunshot, not with a dramatic invasion you can mark on a calendar. It's slower, quieter, more arrogant. It begins in the accounting books, not on the battlefield. It starts when money stops being a measure of value and becomes a political tool. Rome, Spain, Britain, and now the United States. 4 times in recorded history, a dominant empire has walked the same road. Military overextension. Spending that can never be repaid. A currency quietly corrupted, inflation that erodes trust, and finally, collapse. Every time the people in charge had the same belief, we're different, the rules don't apply to us. Every time they were wrong. And in 2020, the United States is walking through the same gates, step by step, warning sign by warning sign. The only question left is not if the pattern is real, but where we are on its timeline, the beginning, the middle, or the end. This is the story of how empires destroy themselves through their own money. How Rome, Spain, and Britain each committed economic suicide. And why every signal now flashing in the global financial system says, it's happening again. Let's start where imperial finance was practically invented. Rome. For more than 500 years, Rome was not just a state, it was a system. From the Scottish hills to the deserts of Egypt, from the Atlantic coast to the rivers of Mesopotamia, around 60 million people lived under Roman rule. Its roads were the arteries of trade. Its legions were the shock troops of order. Its laws, its language, its architecture. Centuries later, we still live in their shadow. But beneath all those symbols of power, there was something more important, more invisible. Trust in a coin, the denarius. Introduced in 211 BC, the Roman denarius was a small silver coin, weighing roughly 4.5 grams of nearly pure silver. For centuries, that coin meant something precise. When you were paid in denarii, you knew what you were holding. Real metal, real value. That consistency did something magical. It connected a farmer in Gaul to a shopkeeper in Alexandria. It allowed a soldier in Judea to send money home to his family in Italy. It allowed Rome to tax, to trade, to build, to conquer. A stable currency is a silent empire builder. People don't think about it when it works. They only notice when it breaks. But empires, by design, are expensive machines. Every new province Rome conquered required more. More legions to garrison the borders. More forts, more roads, more granaries, more administrators, more pensions. Every frontier outpost was a recurring bill. And over time, like every empire that would follow, Rome developed a simple problem with no easy answer. Its ambitions were larger than its income. Rather than shrink its ambitions, Rome chose the same solution modern states quietly choose today. It changed the money. Under Emperor Nero, ruling from 54 to 68 AD, the first serious crack appeared. Nero needed to pay for 2 things, his lifestyle and his legions, golden palaces and distant wars. So he did something deceptively small. He ordered the silver content of the denarius to be reduced from nearly 100% to about 90%. On the surface, nothing had changed. The coins looked the same, carried the same emperor's face, the same stamp, the same name. But under the surface, Rome could now mint 11 coins with the silver that used to make 10. The state had discovered a powerful drug, hidden inflation. At first, it felt painless. 10% less silver in each coin still left a lot of value. Soldiers were still paid. Roads were still built. Bread was still baked. The empire didn't collapse in a day, but the precedent was set. Future emperors facing their own crises, wars, rebellions, border threats, political bribes, looked back and saw what Nero had done, and they pushed the same lever further. By the time Emperor Caracalla came to power in the early 3rd century, the denarius had been cut to roughly 50% silver, half money, half illusion. By 265 AD, under Emperor Gallienus, the silver content had collapsed to around 5%. A coin that had once been real money was now mostly cheap base metal with a thin silver wash. Imagine being a Roman soldier in that era. Your salary might be written in the same number of denarii as your grandfather's. But the actual value, what those coins could buy, had been sliced to a fraction. The government insisted nothing had changed. The coin said denarius. It bore the emperor's image. Officially, it was still money. But markets are not fooled by slogans. Prices began to scream the truth the state refused to say out loud. What might have cost 1 denarius around 200 AD could cost dozens by 300 AD. Some estimates suggest 50 times more. Farmers who had once willingly accepted coins for grain now demanded barter, actual goods in exchange for goods, because they no longer trusted the state's metal. And when money stops working as a store of value, people instinctively return to older, clumsier systems. Gold, livestock, direct exchange, anything but the state's promise. The consequences cascaded. Soldiers refused to fight unless they were paid in gold, in land, or in physical goods. Tax collectors struggled to extract real value from a population drowning in fake coins. Long-distance trade shrank. Why ship cargo across seas for money that might be worthless by the time you arrive? Rome's economy didn't explode. It seized up. And here is the uncomfortable truth. At this point, Rome still had armies. It still had fortifications. It still had engineers and administrators. Barbarians did not suddenly become stronger than Rome overnight. The rot came from the inside. The empire had chosen to destroy the foundation of its own power, the trust in its currency, rather than confront the reality of its overspending. By 476 AD, when the Western Roman Empire officially collapsed, the final blow came not because foreign tribes had invented a better army, but because Rome had lost the ability to pay for one. The state could no longer reliably fund soldiers, maintain roads, or enforce its own laws across its vast territory. The coin had died. Everything built on that coin followed. The pattern is already visible here, in Rome's story. Military expansion, spending beyond revenue, currency debasement to hide the gap, inflation that destroys purchasing power, loss of trust, breakdown of economic function, collapse. Rome proves the pattern once. History will not stop there. 12 centuries later, another empire will rise, this time with what appears to be infinite wealth pouring in from across the ocean. An empire that discovers too late that having too much money can be just as dangerous as having too little. Spain. Spain's rise in the 1500s looked nothing like Rome's slow-building ascent. It was sudden, explosive, almost unnatural. Within a few decades, Spain went from a fragmented kingdom on Europe's western edge to the richest empire the world had ever seen, powered not by industry or innovation, but by something far more intoxicating: silver, mountains of it, rivers of it, more wealth than any civilization had ever touched. When Christopher Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, he couldn't have imagined that within one generation, Spain would control entire continents. The conquests of Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro brought down the Aztec and Incan empires, civilizations with palaces of gold, intricate tax systems, and tens of millions of subjects. But the true miracle of the Spanish Empire came in 1545, when Spanish miners discovered Cerro Rico in the high Andes of modern-day Bolivia. It would soon be called the mountain that eats men, because it devoured more than human lives. It devoured the future of an empire. The silver flood that rewired the world. Cerro Rico was not a mine. It was the single greatest silver deposit ever discovered by humanity. For nearly a century, Spain controlled nearly half the world's silver supply. Ships left the port of Veracruz and Lima loaded so heavily with silver bars that pirate fleets formed entire industries around catching them. Spanish galleons sailed across the Atlantic like floating vaults. Every coin stamped with the Spanish royal seal, pieces of 8, became the world's first true global currency. From Europe to China, from North Africa to the Philippines, the Spanish silver dollar became trusted everywhere. It was as close to a world currency as the medieval world could imagine. The irony: this global trust did not come from Spanish financial genius, but from geology. But geology does not build empires, and geology cannot tell kings no. Spain made the same fatal assumption many powerful nations would repeat centuries later. If we have more money, we must be richer. When wealth makes you poor, the more silver Spain dug out of the Americas, the more it shipped back to Europe. And the more money poured into Spain, the more worthless money became. This wasn't because Spain debased its coins like Rome did. The coins remained mostly pure. The problem was volume. When the money supply explodes while the supply of goods stays the same, prices rise. Every economist now recognizes this. Spain lived it. Between 1500 and 1600, Europe experienced what historians now call the price revolution, a century-long inflation shock that increased prices by up to tenfold. Inflation was not evenly distributed. It struck hardest at the very heart of the Spanish economy. Farmers could not keep up with rising costs. Merchants lost competitiveness against France, England, and the Netherlands. Spanish craftsmen were wiped out because importing goods was cheaper than producing them. Why bother building industries when ships of silver arrived every month? Spain didn't innovate, it imported. It didn't industrialize, it consumed. It didn't create wealth, it extracted it, then immediately spent it abroad. Silver flowed into Spain from the colonies, and then flowed out just as quickly to pay France, Italy, England, and the Netherlands for goods Spain never produced. Spain was like a lottery winner who burned through the winnings faster than they came in. The empire with infinite money and infinite debt. Even with limitless silver, Spain constantly overspent. Its kings, especially Philip II, ruling from 1556 to 1598, believed empire was a destiny that must be funded at all costs. Philip II inherited a massive debt of 36 million ducats from his father. But instead of reducing spending or building new economic foundations, he doubled down on expansion. A war in the Mediterranean against the Ottoman Empire. A rebellion in the Netherlands. Support for Catholic allies across Europe. And of course, the disastrous Spanish Armada sent against England in 1588. The most expensive naval gamble of the age. Every empire eventually reaches a point where military ambition exceeds financial reality. Philip hit that point quickly. And then he did something no empire had ever done at scale. He declared bankruptcy. In 1557, Philip II suspended all repayments on Spain's debt. It was the first sovereign default of the modern era, but not the last. Spain defaulted again in 1560, 1575, 1596. 4 defaults in less than 40 years. This was not mismanagement. It was systemic failure. Spain controlled half the world's silver and still couldn't pay its bills. When creditors stopped believing the emperor, each default destroyed trust in Spanish bonds. Foreign lenders demanded higher and higher interest rates. Just like today, higher borrowing costs made the debt spiral even worse. And so, Spain turned to the only remaining lever, currency manipulation. Spanish mints secretly diluted silver coins with base metals. Copper coins were issued with official values far higher than their real worth. The government insisted the coins were equal to silver. The market said otherwise. Confidence collapsed. Merchants refused Spanish money. Trade partners demanded payment in foreign coins. A currency trusted across continents was suddenly suspect. And without trust, an empire loses its economic skeleton. Spain's long fall from glory. By the mid-1600s, Spain was entering irreversible decline. It couldn't fund the army needed to maintain control over its vast colonies. It couldn't repay foreign creditors. It couldn't keep inflation under control. It couldn't compete with industrial powers like England and the Netherlands. The 30 Years' War, 1618 or 1648, drained the last of its strength. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 is widely seen as the beginning of Spain's imperial collapse. By 1700, after a century of inflation, mismanagement, and repeated defaults, Spain's empire was a hollow shell. Too large to govern, too poor to defend, too indebted to recover. The pattern appears again: massive influx of wealth. Government overspending, excessive borrowing, inflation destroying purchasing power, repeated defaults, collapse of currency trust, imperial decline. Spain did not fall because someone conquered it. It fell because it confused money with wealth and paid the price. But if Spain drowned in silver and Rome choked on debased coins, the next empire would fall for a different reason entirely. An empire of steam, steel, global trade routes, and a currency so powerful the sun literally never set on it. If Rome fell because it devalued its currency, and Spain fell because it drowned in its own silver, then Britain fell for a more modern reason: debt. Massive, world-reshaping, nation-breaking debt. Britain built the largest empire in human history. At its peak in 1922, it ruled 458 million people, nearly a quarter of humanity. 1 out of every 4 square miles on Earth had the Union Jack flying over it. And behind this planetary reach stood a single source of power: the British pound sterling, the world's reserve currency for over 2 centuries. For more than 200 years, the global economy ran on a simple truth: 1 pound sterling equals a fixed weight of gold. Not a slogan, not a promise, a fact. A merchant in Bombay, a bank in Cairo, a cotton trader in New York, all trusted the pound because they could walk into a bank and redeem it for physical gold. This was the gold standard, the financial backbone of the modern world. But an empire that spans continents also spans obligations. Every colony demanded administration, infrastructure, soldiers, bureaucrats, naval protection. And when trouble erupted in India, in Egypt, in South Africa, in China, the empire paid for the solution with borrowed money. Britain's power was built on credit, and as long as the pound held its value, the world kept lending, until a global catastrophe broke everything. World War I, the first blow to the pound. In 1914, when World War I began, Britain had one of the strongest financial positions on Earth. Its national debt was roughly $650 million, manageable for a world economic center. But the war was not manageable. It was a machine built to swallow money and men in equal quantities. The Western Front devoured resources faster than any conflict in recorded history. By the end of the war in 1918, Britain owed $7 billion, or a tenfold increase in only 5 years. Most of this debt was owed to the United States. Britain, for the first time in centuries, was no longer the world's principal creditor. It had become the world's most indebted empire. And to survive the war, Britain had done something dangerous. It left the gold standard. A currency that had been as good as gold was now backed only by government promises. Sound familiar? Churchill's catastrophic mistake. After the war, Britain dreamed of restoring its prestige by returning to gold. But returning to gold at the old exchange rate, as if the war had never happened, forced the pound into an artificially strong position. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, made a fateful decision. Britain rejoined the gold standard at the pre-war value. The results were catastrophic. British exports became too expensive. Factories struggled, unemployment soared, domestic debt became harder to service. The government had to raise interest rates to defend the overvalued currency. Churchill later admitted it was the worst mistake of his career. By 1931, the pound could no longer be defended. Britain abandoned gold for good. The pound was devalued. Global trust wavered. But the real death blow hadn't arrived yet. World War II, the debt that broke the empire. When World War II began in 1939, Britain was already weak. Its national debt was enormous. Its industrial base was aging. Its empire was restless. Yet to defeat Nazi Germany, Britain spent everything it had, and everything it didn't. By 1945, Britain's national debt reached 270% of GDP, one of the highest in world history. London was bombed to rubble. Shipping lanes were decimated. Food had to be rationed. Factories were destroyed. And most importantly, Britain was bankrupt. The empire that once loaned money to the world now owed billions to the United States. To keep fighting, Britain signed the Anglo-American Loan Agreement, essentially mortgaging its empire to survive the war. And while Britain fought for its life, the world's financial architecture was being rewritten without British control. Bretton Woods, the moment the pound died. In 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, 44 nations gathered to rebuild the global economic system after the war. Everyone knew the truth. Britain no longer had the gold to back its currency. It no longer had the industrial might to support reserve status. It no longer had the financial credibility to set global rules. The United States did. And so, the US dollar replaced the British pound as the world's primary reserve currency. It was the economic funeral of an empire. Quiet, inevitable, permanent. Britain fought desperately to keep the pound strong, but no amount of speeches or pride could replace the gold and industrial base that had been lost. The empire unravels. The years after the war were a slow-motion collapse. 1947, Britain tried to make the pound fully convertible again. It lasted 6 weeks before a run on the currency forced a reversal. 1949, pound devalued by 30%. 1956, the Suez Crisis exposed that Britain could no longer project military power without U.S. permission. 1967, pound devalued again. 1970s, inflation hit 25%, forcing Britain to beg the IMF for a bailout. This was the empire's final humiliation. The nation that once controlled a quarter of the earth had to request emergency funds from an international lender to stay afloat. Meanwhile, Britain's colonies fell away one by one. India in 1947, Ghana in 1957, Malaysia in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963. Dozens more in the years that followed. The British Empire didn't collapse in a dramatic war. It evaporated. It dissolved from within, shrunk by debts it could never repay, and a currency the world no longer trusted. The pattern repeated with brutal clarity. War debt that exceeded national capacity. Leaving the gold standard, currency devaluation, loss of reserve, currency status, massive inflation, retreat from global influence. Imperial collapse. Rome fell by debasing its coin. Spain fell by drowning in silver. Britain fell by borrowing beyond its means. Different mechanisms, the same pattern. And now we reach the final and most important part of the story, the empire we live in today, the one whose currency powers every central bank, every trade agreement, every international settlement, the United States. And for the first time in 80 years, the pattern that broke Rome, Spain, and Britain is repeating itself again, right now, in real time. For 80 years, the United States has been the center of the global financial universe. Its currency is the backbone of world trade. Its military encircles the planet. Its debt markets set the rhythm of global capital. But no empire ever believes it is repeating history until the mirror is right in front of it. Rome thought it was different. Spain thought it was chosen. Britain thought it was eternal. And now the United States believes it is exceptional. Yet the numbers, the debt, the monetary behavior, the geopolitics, all whisper the same story. The pattern has returned. The dollar, the modern denarius. In 1944, when the world gathered at Bretton Woods to rebuild the post-war order, the United States emerged with unmatched strength. 2/3 of global gold reserves, an intact industrial base, a military unrivaled anywhere. The world's largest economy, the Bretton Woods system, made the U.S. dollar the world's reserve currency. Every major nation pegged its currency to the dollar, and the dollar in turn was redeemable for gold at $35 per ounce. This meant one thing: the U.S. dollar was not just a currency, it was a global store of value. Trust in the dollar was trust in the American century. But trust comes with temptation. As the Roman emperors discovered, as Britain discovered, the moment a currency is trusted everywhere, the government that issues it acquires a dangerous power, the power to cheat slowly. The first warning shot: Vietnam and the Great Society. By the 1960s, the United States was fighting an expensive war in Vietnam while simultaneously funding enormous domestic social programs under the Great Society. The spending was politically popular. The budget deficits were not. So the government printed dollars, quietly, steadily. Foreign governments noticed. Most importantly, Charles de Gaulle, France's president, understood the danger. If the U.S. printed dollars freely, but kept promising that each dollar was worth a fixed amount of gold, then the dollar's value was an illusion. So France began sending in dollars to redeem gold. Other countries followed. Gold reserves drained rapidly from Fort Knox. The world was calling America's bluff. Just like Rome with its denarius, just like Britain defending an overvalued pound, the U.S. faced a choice: admit the spending was unsustainable or abandon the foundation of the system. In 1971, President Richard Nixon made the fateful decision. He closed the gold window. Dollars would no longer be backed by gold. It was the moment the US dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed by nothing but faith in the American government's promises. Economists still call it the Nixon shock, but it was not a shock. It was the beginning of the pattern. The petrodollar, a lifeline bought with oil, without gold backing, the dollar needed a new source of global demand, and Washington found one. In the 1970s, the U.S. struck a deal with Saudi Arabia. Saudi oil would be sold only in U.S. dollars. Every other oil-producing nation followed. This created artificial demand for the dollar. Every country needed dollars to buy oil. Every central bank kept dollar reserves. Every global transaction was priced in dollars. This petrodollar system extended the lifespan of the American empire dramatically. But lifelines are not immortality. The explosion of debt, America's fatal arithmetic. In 1980, U.S. national debt was $900 billion, large but manageable. By 2000, it had reached $5.6 trillion. By 2020, $27 trillion. In 2025, over $36 trillion. That's a 40-fold increase in 45 years. No empire in history has accumulated debt this quickly and survived long-term. But the debt alone is not the pattern. The pattern is how the debt is financed, by printing money. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve began quantitative easing, creating trillions of dollars electronically to stabilize the economy. But each time the Fed printed money to solve a crisis, the government grew bolder. During the 2020 pandemic, the U.S. printed over $4 trillion in just 2 years, more money than it had printed in the previous century. And just like Rome diluting its silver, just like Spain flooding Europe with bullion, the United States insisted, we can do this forever. There will be no consequences. But the consequences came. They always do. Inflation, the old enemy, returns. In 2022, inflation officially reached 9%, the highest in 40 years. Unofficially, in food, housing, healthcare, it was far higher. For the first time in a generation, Americans felt the quiet terror that ancient Romans once felt. Your money buys less each year. Your savings evaporate. Your wage slips behind reality. Your currency weakens in your own hands. Inflation is not a number. It is a message that something fundamental is breaking. The loss of reserve currency status has begun. In 2000, 70% of global foreign reserves were held in U.S. dollars. Today, it is 58% and falling every year. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have begun trading in local currencies, creating new financial systems independent of the West, reducing dollar dependency. Buying gold at record levels, China and Russia in particular understand the empire pattern. They are preparing for the next world reserve currency. This is exactly how the world prepared for Britain's fall in the 1940s, and how Europe hedged itself against Spain in the 1600s. The world is not abandoning the dollar suddenly. It is rebalancing slowly, silently, just as it has done before every imperial collapse. The military burden, the Roman shadow. The United States maintains nearly 800 military bases in more than 70 countries with a defense budget over $800 billion per year, and decades-long wars that have cost more than $8 trillion. This is the Roman problem, the same problem that drained Spain, the same problem that bankrupted Britain. An empire expanded beyond the means of the currency that sustains it. Empires don't collapse because they are defeated. They collapse because they can no longer pay for the cost of projecting power. And the U.S. is approaching that edge. The pattern in plain sight. If you compare the 7 stages of imperial collapse, dominance, overextension, deficit spending, currency debasement, inflation, loss of confidence, collapse. The United States is already in stage 5 and accelerating toward stage 6. Every empire believed it could escape the math. Every empire believed it was special. Every empire believed the rules were different for them. But the economic laws that ended Rome, Spain, and Britain have no exemptions. They are as absolute as gravity. And now they are pointing toward a future that becomes clearer and darker each year. So the question is no longer if the cycle ends, but how it ends. Every empire tells itself the same story. That was them. This is us. That was the past. We are the future. That collapse was their failure. We are smarter, richer, more advanced. But history is not fooled by confidence. It tracks something simpler, colder, and far more objective. Numbers. While politics change, while cultures evolve, the mathematics of empire remain identical. And when you compare the four great collapses, Rome, Spain, Britain, and now the United States, a chilling truth emerges. All four empires followed the exact same seven-stage sequence. Not similar, not coincidental, nearly identical. Let's walk through the pattern clearly, because this is the spine of the entire story, the skeleton key that unlocks 2,000 years of imperial rise and fall, and the reason the modern world is sleepwalking into a financial storm of its own creation. Stage 1. Dominance, the golden age of confidence. Every empire begins at the top of the world. Rome ruled 3 continents. Spain commanded the oceans. Britain controlled global trade routes. The United States became the post-war superpower, its currency the backbone of global finance. At this stage, the empire's military is unmatched. Its economy is the world's largest. Its currency is trusted everywhere. Its people believe the empire is permanent. This is the high, the moment of maximum strength. It is also the moment when decline secretly begins, because dominance breeds overconfidence. Stage 2. Overextension. The empire grows. Too big power is addictive. Empires always reach for just one more province, colony, or influence zone. Rome stretched from Britain to the Middle East. Spain reached from the Philippines to Peru. Britain colonized every corner of the earth. America built military bases in 70 countries. At first, expansion feels profitable. New lands bring new taxes, new trade, new resources. But every added territory also demands soldiers, administrators, roads, ports, defenses, subsidies, naval protection. And slowly, the empire becomes a global landlord who cannot afford to maintain his own properties. This is the moment the math begins to turn. Stage 3. Deficit spending, when ambition exceeds income. At this stage, imperial budgets break. Rome needed to fund constant legions on far borders. Spain needed ships, wars, and court luxuries. Britain needed to maintain a global navy and endless colonial administrations. America funds trillion-dollar wars, global bases, social programs, and political promises. The costs become structural, permanent, politically impossible to reverse. So leaders choose the easiest path. Borrow, borrow, borrow. Debt climbs. Budgets never balance. Deficits become normalized. The public barely notices, because at this stage the currency still feels strong, but underneath, something cracks. Stage 4. Currency debasement, the fatal shortcut. This is the point of no return. When the empire can no longer tax enough or borrow cheaply enough, it quietly sabotages its own currency. Rome removed silver from its coins. Spain flooded Europe with silver, reducing each coin's purchasing power. Britain abandoned gold, then repeatedly devalued the pound. America left the gold standard entirely and began printing money at unmatched historical scale. Every empire says the same thing. We're not devaluing the currency, we're simply stabilizing the economy. Every time they are lying, sometimes even to themselves. Because the empire's survival now depends on one hope, that people do not notice the money is dying. Stage 5. Inflation, the first visible crack. At this stage, the public finally feels what the government has been hiding. Roman farmers demanded barter instead of coins. Spanish merchants raised prices tenfold. Britain saw inflation hit 25% in the 1970s. America is seeing persistent inflation in real essentials: food, housing, healthcare, regardless of official numbers. Inflation is not an economic glitch. It is a political confession. It is the moment the currency whispers to its citizens, "I cannot protect your savings anymore," and it always leads to the next stage. Stage 6. Loss of confidence, the moment empires cannot reverse. Once trust cracks, it shatters. Roman soldiers demanded gold or land. European bankers stopped lending to Spain after its fourth default. The world abandoned the British pound after Bretton Woods. Today, nations are diversifying away from the US dollar, realigning trade, buying gold, and creating new financial networks. This stage is the tipping point, the moment when the empire loses the benefit of the doubt. Once the world begins preparing for life after the empire's currency, the empire's collapse is no longer a future risk. It is a countdown. Stage 7, collapse. The end of imperial power. Collapses look different on the surface but identical underneath. Rome lost the ability to pay its armies and maintain its infrastructure. Spain became irrelevant, unable to service its debt or control its colonies. Britain surrendered global leadership and dissolved its empire in a matter of decades. America's version will not look like Rome's barbarian invasions, nor will it look like Spain's regional irrelevance, nor will it look like Britain's post-war decline. It will be more complex because this time the world is financially interconnected. Global trade, banking, debt markets, and currency reserves are all tied to the dollar. When the US enters Stage 7, the entire international system enters Stage 7 with it. This is what makes the next part of the story more urgent than any historical collapse. This time, it won't just be one empire falling. It will be the entire global financial order. So where are we now? Rome collapsed after its denarius became nearly worthless. Spain collapsed after endless wealth brought endless inflation. Britain collapsed after war debts consumed the pound. The United States shows unmistakable signs. Deficit spending is permanent, debt is uncontrollable. Money printing is normalized, inflation is persistent, global confidence in the dollar is eroding. We are no longer debating if, we are debating where in the pattern America currently stands. And the evidence is overwhelming. The US is in Stage 5, accelerating into Stage 6. 3 possible futures. What happens after Stage 7? History gives us 3 outcomes when empires reach the breaking point. 1. Controlled decline, the British path. Painful but manageable, the empire loses dominance but remains functional. A future where the US loses reserve status. The dollar weakens but doesn't die. The country adapts to being a normal power. This requires political discipline, something America has not shown in decades. 2. Chaotic collapse. The Roman path. This is the nightmare scenario. Currency implodes, government loses control, internal conflict rises, institutions fracture. Not just economic collapse, but social collapse. 3. Reset and restructure. The Spanish to British transition. A new global currency replaces the old one. Gold-backed, digital, a BRICS basket, a new international system. This outcome is disruptive, but survivable. And now the most dangerous truth. Rome's collapse affected the Mediterranean. Spain's collapse affected Europe. Britain's collapse affected its colonies. America's collapse will affect the entire world. Every central bank, every global trade route, every major commodity, every emerging economy, every financial market. This time, the empire controls the global system itself. And the system is now showing the same fractures that destroyed every empire before it. The final part of this documentary is the most important. A clear, cinematic, deeply researched explanation of what comes next and why the timing may be closer than most people bet. Every empire reaches a moment when the numbers stop being abstract and start defining reality. Rome hit that moment when soldiers refused debased coins. Spain hit that moment when creditors slammed their doors. Britain hit that moment when the United States replaced the pound at Bretton Woods. And now the United States is approaching that same inflection point. A moment when the bill arrives after decades of borrowing against the future. Empires do not collapse because people lose faith in ideology. They collapse because people lose faith in the money. Because the truth is simple, you can govern a nation without public trust, but you cannot govern a currency without it. Today, the US stands where the world's greatest powers once stood, at the edge of the pattern, staring at 3 possible futures. This is the ending that history has written before, but the world has never been this globalized, this interconnected, This dependent on a single currency, which means the ending will feel familiar, but unfold on a scale humanity has never seen. Let's walk through the three paths and what they would mean for you, for the world, and for the next era of global power. Path 1, controlled decline, the British escape route. This is the soft landing. It's what Britain lived through after 1945. Painful, humiliating, but survivable. Britain lost the empire, lost the pound's reserve currency status, endured decades of inflation and austerity, became a secondary economic power, but it remained a functioning democracy. Its society did not collapse. Its institutions survived. For the United States, a controlled decline would look like the dollar slowly replaced by a multi-currency reserve system, reduced global presence, lower military spending, shrinking influence at international institutions, gradual devaluation of living standards, a generational adjustment to a world where America is not the center, economically painful, politically destabilizing, but not catastrophic. However, this scenario requires something the United States has avoided for decades: fiscal discipline, political unity, a realistic acceptance of limits. If America cannot choose restraint, the next two paths become more likely. Path 2, chaotic collapse, the Roman trajectory. This is the nightmare scenario, and history shows it happens when currencies fail, suddenly inflation accelerates uncontrollably, debt becomes unserviceable. The government loses credibility. Foreign creditors refuse to roll over loans. Social trust fractures. Rome did not collapse because of barbarians. It collapsed because it could no longer pay its armies. Spain did not collapse because of conquest. It collapsed because inflation hollowed out its economy and lenders abandoned it. Britain did not avoid collapse. It simply collapsed slowly. But the United States is different for one reason. If the dollar collapses, the global system collapses. In a chaotic scenario, America could experience a rapid drop in the dollar's value, loss of reserve currency status within months, bank failures, mass inflation or hyperinflation, a sovereign debt crisis, breakdown of global trade, since most trade depends on USD, social unrest from evaporating savings and rising prices. This scenario is brutal but historically consistent. It is what happens when denial continues until the system breaks violently. This could trigger what historians would later call the first global currency crisis. Path 3, reset and restructure, the birth of a new financial order. This is the scenario that ends one empire's era, but launches another. History shows that when currencies collapse, the world does not stay leaderless for long. Rome's fall paved the way for Byzantine and Islamic monetary systems. Spain's decline fueled the rise of Dutch and British finance. Britain's collapse in 1944 birthed the dollar-led order of Bretton Woods. Every collapse contains the seed of the next system. In the modern world, a reset could take several shapes. Option A, gold-backed global currency nations, exhausted with fiat money, return to something with intrinsic value. Central banks already bought more gold in the last 3 years than at any time since the 1950s. Option B, a BRICS-backed multi-nation reserve currency, a basket currency backed by China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, and new members like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, UAE. This could become a trade-focused alternative to the dollar. Option C, a digital reserve currency, a CBDC, central bank digital currency, backed by major economies. Blockchain trust replacing petrodollar trust. Option D, the dollar 2.0 reset. The U.S. restructures its debt and introduces a new dollar, backed by commodities, backed by gold, or backed by a smaller, reformed financial base. Painful, but survivable. The hardest truth. This time is different. And far worse, Rome's collapse hurt its own citizens. Spain's collapse hurt its colonies and Europe's markets. Britain's collapse reshaped the post-war world. But America's collapse will affect global trade, global banking, global commodities, global supply chains, global debt markets, global savings, global currencies, global stability. Because for the first time in history, the world built its entire economy on one empire's currency. The dollar is 88% of global FX transactions, 60% of global reserves, 75% of international trade invoices, nearly 100% of oil trade, the foundation of global banking collateral, the benchmark for emerging market loans. When the dollar weakens, countries collapse. When the dollar strengthens, countries collapse. When the dollar dies, the system collapses. This is why the world is not laughing at the idea of a U.S. decline. It is quietly preparing for it. The final question, how much time is left? No historian, economist, or politician can name the exact year or moment an empire falls, but they can identify the phase. And the phase America is in today is the one Rome was in around the mid-3rd century, the one Spain was in by the late 1500s, the one Britain was in by the early 1940s. Stage 5, accelerating into Stage 6. Inflation has revealed the currency's weakness. Global diversification has revealed declining trust. Debt has revealed the unsustainability of the system. Geopolitical fragmentation has revealed the limits of American power. We are watching the beginning of the end of the dollar's unchallenged dominance. The pattern is not prophecy, it is precedent. Empires do not collapse because someone defeats them. They collapse because they violate the math that holds them together. And history whispers that the United States is closer to that edge than it wants to believe. The last message, history never lies. Rome believed it was different. Spain believed it was chosen. Britain believed it was eternal. America believes it is exceptional. But the pattern has never been broken. Not once. Not in 2,000 years. Because economic laws are not flexible. They do not negotiate. They do not respond to ideology, patriotism, or pride. You cannot print wealth. You cannot borrow without limit. You cannot debase a currency forever. 4 empires, 4 collapses, 4 identical sequences. The United States is next, whether through controlled decline, violent collapse, or global reset. The only uncertainty is the timeline, and how prepared the world will be when the 7th stage finally arrives. If this gave you a new understanding of the present through the lens of history, subscribe, because when the pattern completes, you will want to understand exactly what happened and why.